Richard heeft niet alleen onderzoek natuurlijk gedaan, de Marron in Suriname of de Samaka in Suriname. We weten dat er een heel groot gemeenschap is van de Marron aan de Franse kant. Ik hoorde cijfers zelfs van bijna 1/3 van de Marrons in Suriname wonen aan de Franse kant. Ik weet niet of dat helemaal klopt, maar dat horen we dan straks wel. En Richard gaat het hebben over de actuele leefomstandigheden van de Marrons in Frans Guyana.
Hello again. Since 1986, the beginning of the Binnenlandse Oorlog in Suriname, Sally and I have moved our research to Guyana, French Guyana, following many Maroons. In 2003, Sally and I wrote a little book in French. It doesn't exist in English. It's called Les Marrons. And it was intended to teach the people in French Guyana who met all these Maroons every day in schools, in the hospital, in the prison, everywhere, who they were, because people in French Guyana just say Businenge, think they're all the same. So this book tells the history of Samaka, Juka, Pamaka, Aluku coming to Guyana, how each group has different status there, and so on. And then we've been going back to Guyana since 2003, doing other projects, but we realized this book is out of date. So much has changed in the last 15 years. So we went back in January and February this year to do fieldwork so that we could do a new edition, a new version of this book, which will be published in 2019, at the beginning of next year. And I want to give you some of the most striking conclusions about all the changes that we found about Maroons in Guyana. First of all, we worked very hard on demography. These are our conclusions. First of all, there are almost 100,000 Maroons living in Guyana today, 99,000 about. About 47,000 Jukas, so almost half of the Jukas in the world live in Guyana. 36,000 Samaka, 10,000 Aluku, 7,000 Pamaka. Maroons now make up 35% of the population of Guyana. 1 person in 3, in other words, is a Maroon. Our calculations also show that the total population of Suriname Maroons in the world altogether is about 263,000 people. 140,000 in Suriname, 99,000 in Guyana, and about 24,000 in Europe and the United States, and a few in places like South Africa and China and so on. This means that about 38% of all Maroons live in Guyana today, and about 53% of all Maroons live in Suriname. In other words, a great number of Maroons live in Guyana. Okay. A second conclusion is that only about 1% of Maroons in Guyana live in what you could call traditional villages. 1%. That is, the Aluku villages, the Boni villages along the Lawa that existed 30 years ago, only 1% of Maroons, 1,200 people, still live in those villages. Villages like this is Assisi, 50 years ago. Only 1% of people still live in that. And that's a tremendous contrast with Suriname, where maybe 30,000 Samakas still live on the Suriname River. The villages have changed, of course, but they're still there. 20-some-odd thousand Jukas live on the Tapanahoni. But in Guyana, Maroons don't live in these villages anymore, 1%. 99% of all Maroons in Guyana live in modern towns, either in the interior or on the coast. I want to show you some images of where Maroons live now. Here's Maripasula, which is the farthest town upriver. It's right across from a Brazilian town in Suriname. It's called Ronaldo or Albina Tve. And what it is 30 supermarkets, Chinese supermarkets, 30. And there's also a couple of discotheques and whorehouses, brothels, and so on. And there's a church also, Asamblea de Dios. And it's all for Brazilians who are the gold miners in Guyana, garimpeiros, illegal gold mining on Aluku territory. Here are a couple of other pictures of Maipasula. This is public housing in Maipasula, where some Alukus still live. Then we go to Papaistone. That commune is where all of the traditional Aluku villages are, except the village of Kotika, which is on the Suriname side. Hardly anyone is there anymore. So all the Alukus who live in a traditional village live in Papaistone, but very few of them still live in those villages. Most live in this town, which is a new town, and it looks like it is. You can see the river in the back. This is what it looks like. All of the trucks and cars are brought upriver by canoe because there's no road to this coast. But there are airports. There are 4 flights a day from Maipasula to the coast. So this is Papaistone, the Aluku capital. This is Papaistone. It doesn't look like a traditional Aluku village. Then we go to the Juca town of Gran Santi. The commune of Gran Santi is right across from Stulman's Island. And the people who live there are very largely below Juca, from places like Tabiki, Fandaki, and so on, which are a half hour away by canoe. But as you can see, it doesn't look anything like. This is Gran Santi. This is Gran Santi. It's a Juca school teacher in the college, the Middelbare School. He went for 6 months to the University of Mississippi in the United States on an exchange, and he visited the home of Elvis, Graceland. So this is what he's building. It's not finished yet, but it's Graceland on the lava. And then we get to the largest majority Maroon city in the world, Saint Laurent du Maroni, just across the river from Albina. There are 60,000 people today in Saint Laurent. It's soon, in 4 years, it will be bigger than Cayenne. And of those 60,000 people, 46,000 are Maroons. So this is the original public housing in Saint Laurent. They tried to make it look like Maroon houses. It's La Charbonnière. This is where lots of Maroons are living today, in Saint Laurent. This is public housing. If a woman has 4 children, she gets about 3,000 euros a month from the child welfare, and they pay rent. So it's a salary for them. They feel like it's a salary and they can live, but it's a very far cry from living in a village. These are mostly Maroon housing in Saint Laurent. This is Kourou. This is the Village Samaka the old one in Kourou. This picture is from 15 years ago. Now, Kourou is largely a Samaka. The Samakas dominate the Maroon population, just the way Jukas dominate in Saint Laurent. And now they've built a new Village Samaka. These are built by the state, and they're occupied by Samakas. Many now live in this sort of place, which are quickly becoming like a ghetto. The houses are really poorly constructed, but it's where many Samakas live. So, many young Maroons in Guyana are growing up in some sort of public housing, mainly in ghetto neighborhoods. Exceptional ones do succeed. There are two Juka men in their 20s who grew up in what they call a ghetto in Saint Laurent, and they have gotten diplomas from the famous Sciences Po school in Paris, university. We met a young Samaka girl who's now getting her master's degree this year in that special university, Sciences Po. It's very competitive. There's a Samaka girl from near Saint Laurent whose parents are very poor. They can't read and write. The mother's a cleaning woman. She's just become a doctor and works in a hospital in France. So there are beginning to be success stories through the people born in Saint Laurent, Maroons, Samakas, Jukas, who are succeeding through the school system. The university in Cayenne is now about 30% Maroons, mostly from Saint Laurent. And the West Guyana has just elected a young Juka man, I think he's 23, Layanik Adam, as député to the National Assembly in Paris. He's one of the two députés from Guyana to the National Assembly. He also is a graduate of Sciences Po, the same university in Paris. But these are really exceptions. Most young people in Saint Laurent, Maroons, are at the bottom of the social ladder. They drop out of school, frequent involvement with drugs, and little hope for the future. Given how widespread poverty is among Maroons in Guyana, drug smuggling has become common. The teachers in the collège, the Middelbare School in Saint Laurent, we talked to many of them. They say it's very common for a student, 13 years old, 14 years old, to disappear for a week or 10 days. They come back wearing really nice new sneakers, stuff, and they've been mules. They swallow 100 boliches, I guess you call them, of cocaine, and they take the flight to Paris. There are no controls, there are no scanners or anything. They get 5,000 euros, and they come back. And then they do it again. And the police now estimates that there are 4,000 mule trips a year between Cayenne Airport and Orly Airport in Paris, which means 11 a day. And there are only 2 flights. So, on every flight there are 5 people filled with cocaine. And it's quite serious. When we ask after friends who we knew, they often say, oh no, they're in jail, for being mules. It's very common now, and it's awful. They say that half of the inmates in the penitentiary in Cayenne are drug mules. And they only get sentences of, say, 15 months or a year and a half. So there's a lot of turnover, and many of those people are young Maroons, the majority. Another change in Maroon life that we saw over the last few years is that more and more women are entering the workforce. Those who don't live in apartment buildings sometimes still have abati, gardens in the forest, and grow their own food. Others do sewing or babysitting. Some have been educated in the French system, and then they can get jobs as social workers and sometimes teachers. But most Maroon women in Saint Laurent seem happy having a large number of children, sending them to school, benefiting from French welfare for housing and health care and education. Health care is free, it's very good, much better than Suriname. So people keep coming, because they want their children to have a better life, and they feel they get a better life in Guyana than in Suriname. Another change we observed has to do with the effects of the increasingly sedentary lifestyle. Many Maroons in Guyana, both men and women, but especially women, no longer have muscular bodies the way Marrons did a generation ago. They're really becoming soft and large. And, this is related, it's happening all over the world, but it's very striking to us. It's related to a lifestyle that includes supermarket food, chips, pork chops, and sitting in front of the TV all day. The television's always on in every apartment. We were struck by that on this trip. Another change is the increased migration of Marrons to France. 15 years ago, there were very few Marrons in France. And now, every family of 8 or 10 children, 2 or 3, are somewhere in France. And Diane Vernon, who studied the Juka in Suriname for many years, she was in Normandy the other day, and she said she was in a supermarket in some small town, and she heard a woman talking to her child in Juka. And there are Jukas and Samakas all over France now. Not much in the Paris area, but other places, small towns. Just 2 more observations. The first may be a bit controversial for some of you, but one of the big changes we saw during this recent visit was the increasing influence of evangelical churches. All kinds of Protestant churches like Jehovah's Witnesses and all kinds of Baptist evangelical churches. Many, many Marrons are converting now, just recently. And to give an example of why we were concerned, because people have a right to do what they want to do, but one of the effects is that take the commune of Grand Santi, which is 197% Jukas and a few white people who are school teachers and gendarmes and so on. Otherwise, it's all below Njuka. They're a half hour away by canoe from the villages where their grandmothers lived or their parents. When someone dies there now, they no longer go, even though it's a half hour away. Can you imagine Njuka is not going to a funeral of a close relative? They don't go because they have been taught that there's sorcellerie, wisi, in those villages. So you don't go. So we talk to children, we talk to young people, 15 years old, 18 years old, and say, what village do you come from? Do your parents come from? They say, we don't remember. We don't know the name of it. And then we talk to the parents and they say it's Tabiki, which you can almost see it. It's just, but they can't go. They've never been. So they're cut off from their culture really completely. They're living in these sort of shanty towns that you saw. They're not really, they're Njuka by identity. The mayor of Grand Santi is a Njuka, the town council is Njuka, but they're not living anything like the way their parents or grandparents lived on the Tapanahoni. And at the same time, they're not really French. They're told in school they're French, they have French passports, but they don't speak French much, a little bit, and so on. So there's this in-between generation, and that's a problem in terms of the chances they have for life. And finally, Wim asked me by email the other day, what should the government, why don't Marrons organize? Sort of what Hugo was talking about at the end in Suriname. Then there's several reasons why Marrons, although they are 1/3 of the population, they have no political influence. One reason is that most Marrons in Guyana are not French. Either they're illegal, they don't have papers, or most of them have papers, they have they have carte de séjour, temporary residence permit, the way we do in France, for 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, like having a green card in the United States. But you can't vote. And if you can't vote, you don't have any power politically. The politicians don't listen. So, for example, Saint-Laurent du Maroni has a Creole mayor, but it's 77% Marrons. There are only about 10% Creoles who live there. But there's a Creole mayor since 1983, the same person, and he's been in jail twice. But they still re-elect him because most Maroons don't vote. They can't. That will change as the next generation comes along. And, people Maroons are starting to go to the university in large numbers. So that will change in 10 years or 20 years. But right now, let me give you just another example. Opo Juka and Bilo Juka and Kotika Juka don't get along. They have prejudices with each other in Guyana. And Samakas think of Njukas and Palmakas and Alukus. They call them all Juga. And they'd say they'd rather have their daughter marry a Baka than marry a Juka. And so on. So there are these rivalries. And then, not to mention the Aluku. All the Alukus are 10,000 people in Guyana, but they're all French. And they've been French since 1969. They've lived there since 1776, but they've got their passports and stuff starting around 1970. President Macron recently went to Guyana, and he announced the formation of a council of traditional chiefs, Maroon and Amerindian, Businenge and Amerindian. And so they appointed 5 chiefs who are the spokesmen politically for the Maroons in Guyana, officially. Who are they? 5 Aluku. There's no Samaka. There's no Junka. And, there are 46, how many? I've forgotten how many. There are 47,000 Njuka there, and there are 10,000 Aluku. There are 36,000 Samaka, 10,000 Aluku. But there isn't a single Njuka or Samaka who has any voice in the official politics of French Guyana. So that's really a problem. And it has to do with not being citizens yet, but the children are going to be citizens. Because if you have a parent who was born in French Guyana, and you are born in French Guyana, then you are French, automatically, from birth. And that's happening a lot now because, as you know, Maroons have babies early. And so as the generations change, we are hoping Maroons will start having more of a voice, going to the university, elect Maroons to do things. And then Guyana feels very neglected in France. They feel like Martinique and Guadeloupe, which have the same status as a département, get all the money. And they are neglected that all France cares about in Guyana is the rocket, the Ariane base, which is true, and that they don't get resources. But the people who live in the west of Guyana, who are all the Maroons in Saint Laurent and places and on the river, they feel like the people in Cayenne neglect them. So they're like doubly neglected. They feel they don't have resources. Their schools aren't as good. Nothing they have is as good as it is in Cayenne, just as in the interior of Suriname. Schools aren't what they are in Paramaribo. So we're hoping that with time this will change. But at the moment it was a fairly depressing kind of situation. It seemed to us that we imagine that the villages along the Suriname River are much more vibrant and so on than places like Maipasula and Papayistone are today. Thank you.
Richard, one moment. Wat een triest verhaal als je dat zo hoort. En ja, dat is echt iets om bij na te denken hoe verder met onze gemeenschap aan de Franse kant. Zijn er vragen aan Richard? Ik zie één vraag. Komt eraan, microfoon, of kan je... Doe maar Engels. Ja. Oh, wacht even toch.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for this information. It's really enlightening and frightening. to be honest. But I was thinking, so the rescue will be in more and more babies are being born, like second and third generation, and then they become automatically French. Okay. If I transfer this to another country, for example, New Zealand. In New Zealand, the Aboriginals, the Maoris, they also became part of a situation where they became marginalized. And the rescue for some of them was like cultural houses, where the young and the indigenous became aware and got trained and got the knowledge about their heritage. So will that be like a solution? Cultural houses?
We see no signs of that. The Aluku have become very modern. I mean, the goal is to modernize. That's part of why people convert to Christianity. You know, the models that they have are French models. The television shows that they watch are American and French. So they see a way of living that they aspire to. It's a very strongly consumer society. And the sad thing is that they have in that society, they're really at the bottom, except for those few success people who do well in school. Part of the problem is that these are French schools, the same curriculum as in Paris. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense to a young Samaka kid whose parents don't speak French. I mean, they go to school and they hear French and they try to do their best. And some kids succeed and go all the way through. But a lot of them decide, they have no tradition of doing homework, the usual kinds of things that happen in Suriname too. But it's a real problem. There's no effort in French Guyana to adapt the schools to young Njukas or Pamakas or Samakas. They're learning about Louis XIV. They're not learning about Maonage. So when Sally and I we often go and give talks in collège or lycée in Saint Laurent, where all the students are Maroons. There might be one white kid and 49 Maroons. And when we start out talking in French, they're going to sleep. If we switch to Samaka, oh, wow, then they wake up. But there's no effort like that by other people. Most school teachers are there most of the teachers in French Guyana are metropolitan, white French people, young, on their first teaching assignment. And they go for 2 years or 3 years, and then they come back. And they know very little. That's why this book that we wrote, Les Marrons, is important, because at least they read that and they realize that Samakas and Jukas aren't the same, and that Alukus are different, and that each of these groups has a different history in Guyana. Someone mentioned, I think the two Moses sisters mentioned in one of their charts the village of Tampaki, the Samaka village on the Oiapoque River, the border river between Guyana and Brazil, which was a gigantic Samaka village for 50 years, from 1900 till 1968. It had about 300 Samaka men going back and forth. The men would stay for 3 or 4 years, then come back. They married Creole women. They made babies who spoke Samakan. And many of the girl babies married the next generation of Samaka men who came, and so on. That went on. But today, we went back there now. There isn't a single Samaka there anymore. Not a single Samaka in Tampaki. Once they built Kuhu, and there was labor there, and Samakas went there to build the missile base in the town, Tampaki slowly emptied out. The last time we were there 10 years ago, there were 5 old men, including a kapiteni. Today, there's no one. They're just Brazilian Indians.
Okay. Even, dus Simba. Ja. Laatste vraag.
Richard, you mentioned that the French president elected 5 chiefs, and all the 5 are Aluku. But do they only represent their own people, or do they stand for different Maroon also?
For the last 30 years, we have been struck, Sally and I, going to Guyana, that Alukus claim to speak on behalf of all Maroons. They pretend that they're the only Maroons. And when we give a talk in Guyana to public, we talk about other people too, and there's always someone from the Alukus who say, but we're the French Maroons. When there was a border dispute between the Dutch and the French about the border of the Tapanahoni and the Lawa, the disputed territory, so-called, which was resolved at the end of the 19th century by the Tsar of Russia, or I don't remember, that the Alukus stood up for the French position. So they claim that they're the ones. There's a lot of rivalry. And Salmakas are very proud of having had the only soldier who fought for the French in the Second World War, Cousset Albina. And I wrote a chapter about him in Travels with Toy. They're very proud that the only soldier who died he didn't die, but he was captured by the Germans and he was in a German prison camp, and then he came back to Saint Laurent and he made 15 or 18 babies afterwards. And they're very proud of him because he fought for France. Yeah. So there's this issue of, who's really French and who isn't. Most Salmakas, lots of Salmakas still don't have papers. We meet families of wood carvers. The woman has a gon, an abati. The man's a wood carver. They have children going to school. They've been there 15 years, 20 years. They can't get French papers. They can't get a carte séjour. So they can't go to Cayenne, for instance, because there's a roadblock about 50 kilometers from Saint Laurent. They block the highway, and if you don't have papers, you can't pass. So you have to stay in the West. They don't try to control the border. Like anyone can go from Albina to Saint Laurent and back and forth because the police doesn't really pay attention. They can't. So that's an open border. So they move the border back. And you can't go there if you don't have papers. So that's a real problem for many, many Maroons. More Salmakas than Jukas, because many Jukas come in through Grand Santi, which is the Juka mayor, and it's easier to get papers there than it is in...
Dankjewel, Richard.